September 15th, 1945. The North Atlantic stretched endlessly under a gray sky, waves rolling beneath the hull of a United States Navy transport vessel, cutting through waters that had witnessed the end of the most devastating war in human history. On the ship's deck, a group of German women stood huddled together, their faces pale against the ocean wind, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and bewilderment that seemed to penetrate their very souls. These women had been swept up in the chaos of Germany's surrender just months earlier. Some were nurses who had served in field hospitals near the Eastern Front. Others were clerks and secretaries who had worked in military installations, and a few were civilian volunteers who had found themselves in the wrong place when the Allied forces advanced. Their stories were different, but they shared one terrifying reality. They were now prisoners of war, being transported across an ocean to the land of their supposed enemies. For years, Nazi propaganda had filled their minds with horrifying images of Americans. The posters that had lined German streets showed grotesque caricatures of Allied soldiers with twisted faces, savage expressions, and bestial features. Radio broadcasts had described Americans as bloodthirsty monsters who showed no mercy to their captives. Newspapers had printed stories of unimaginable cruelty, painting a picture of enemies who were barely human. These women had grown up believing that falling into American hands meant certain torture, degradation, or worse. Yet, as they stood on that ship's deck, everything they had been taught began to crumble before their eyes. The American soldiers guarding them bore no resemblance to the monsters of Nazi propaganda. Instead of twisted, savage beasts, they saw young men with clean-shaven faces, bright eyes, and surprisingly gentle demeanor. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely enjoying what we're sharing here. These Americans were tall, broad-shouldered, and healthy-looking in a way that seemed almost impossible after the years of rationing and hardship that had defined wartime Germany. Their uniforms were crisp and well-fitted, their boots polished, their posture confident but not threatening. Some had hair colors the German women rarely saw back home: golden blonde, auburn red, rich brown that caught the sunlight. Their teeth were straight and white when they smiled, and their skin had a healthy glow that spoke of proper nutrition and care. One particular moment shattered years of indoctrination. A young American soldier, perhaps no older than 22, approached the group of women with a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes in his hand. The women instinctively recoiled, expecting violence or mockery. Instead, he simply offered them cigarettes with a shy smile, his movements careful and respectful. When one brave woman finally accepted, her hands trembling with nerves, the soldier lit it for her with a gentle nod. No harsh words, no cruel laughter, no degradation, just a simple human gesture of courtesy. Historians still debate whether the systematic dehumanization of enemies through propaganda was more effective in Nazi Germany than in other warring nations, but the evidence of its impact was written across these women's faces. They had been taught to expect demons, yet they found themselves face to face with what appeared to be ordinary young men who treated them with unexpected dignity. The contradiction was so profound that some women began to whisper among themselves in hushed German, afraid to voice their thoughts too loudly. "They look like actors from the American films we saw before the war," one murmured. Another admitted, "I thought they would be ugly and cruel, but they seem—" She paused, struggling with the forbidden thought, "They seem kind." As the ship continued its journey westward, carrying its cargo of confused and frightened prisoners toward the shores of America, these women would face an even greater shock. What awaited them on American soil would challenge everything they believed about their enemies, their war, and ultimately, about the very nature of truth itself. The propaganda machine that had shaped their understanding of the world was about to be dismantled, piece by piece, by the simple reality of human decency in the most unexpected place. The American coastline emerged from the morning mist like a revelation, its docks stretching into the harbor with wooden piers that seemed to go on forever. Cranes swung lazily overhead, their mechanical arms moving cargo with an efficiency that spoke of a nation untouched by the devastation that had swept across Europe. The smell of salt, oil, and industry drifted across the water as the transport ship eased toward its berth, carrying its cargo of German women toward their first encounter with American soil. Standing at the ship's railing, the women pressed forward to catch their first glimpse of the enemy's homeland. What they saw defied every expectation that Nazi propaganda had carefully constructed in their minds. The harbor was alive with activity, but it was organized, prosperous, and undamaged. No bomb craters scarred the landscape. No burned-out buildings stood as monuments to war's destruction. Instead, warehouses lined the waterfront in neat rows, their walls painted and maintained, while American flags snapped in the breeze from poles that stood straight and proud. But it was the sight of the soldiers waiting on the dock that truly shattered their preconceptions. Rows of American military personnel stood in formation, their uniforms pressed to perfection, their rifles held with casual confidence rather than menacing threat. These men looked nothing like the savage beasts depicted in German wartime illustrations. Instead, they appeared to be what they were: well-fed, healthy young Americans who had grown up on farms in Iowa, in steel towns in Pennsylvania, playing baseball in Texas schoolyards. The physical contrast was staggering and impossible to ignore. The average German man in 1945 stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, his frame often gaunt from years of food shortages and the grinding stress of total war. These American soldiers towered over what the women had known, many reaching 5 feet 9 inches or taller, their shoulders broad from lives of adequate nutrition and physical activity. They moved with an easy confidence that spoke of strength rather than the desperate toughness that war had taught their German counterparts. One young woman, barely 23 and formerly a secretary in a Wehrmacht communications office, whispered to the nurse beside her, "Mein Gott, they're so handsome." The word felt dangerous on her tongue, as if acknowledging the physical appeal of the enemy was somehow a betrayal of everything she had been taught to believe. The nurse, older and more experienced, felt her own heart skip as she watched a tall soldier with sandy brown hair help secure the mooring lines. His movements were fluid and strong, nothing like the weakened men she had nursed in German field hospitals. The process of disembarkation began with an efficiency that surprised the prisoners. American officers moved among them with clipboards, checking names against lists, their voices calm and professional. There was no shouting, no brutal handling, no degrading treatment that Nazi propaganda had promised would await German captives. Instead, the women found themselves treated with a courtesy that seemed almost surreal given their circumstances. Historians still debate whether American treatment of German prisoners of war was influenced more by Geneva Convention requirements or by a genuine cultural tendency toward humanitarian behavior, but the reality experienced by these women was undeniable. When one elderly prisoner stumbled slightly on the gangway, an American sergeant steadied her arm with gentle care. When another woman's bundle of possessions threatened to spill, a young private helped her secure it without being asked. The trucks that waited to transport them inland were clean and well maintained, their engines running smoothly. As the women climbed aboard, they caught glimpses of American civilians who had gathered to watch the arrival. Children stood at the dock's edge, their faces curious rather than hostile. Adults observed with a mixture of interest and caution, but there was no mob mentality, no calls for revenge or punishment. The prisoners were simply another part of the war's aftermath, to be processed and handled according to established procedures. As the convoy pulled away from the harbor and began its journey toward the internment camp, the women pressed their faces to the small windows in the truck beds. What they saw continued to challenge everything they had believed about America. The streets were wide and well paved, lined with buildings that showed no signs of bomb damage. Automobiles moved smoothly along the roads, their chrome gleaming, their occupants appearing well-dressed and prosperous. Electric signs glowed even in daylight, advertising products and services in a display of abundance that seemed almost obscene to women who had lived through years of rationing and scarcity. The journey inland would reveal even more shocking truths about the nation they had been taught to hate and fear, truths that would force them to question not just their understanding of America, but their trust in everything they had been told by their own leaders. The convoy of military trucks rolled through the American countryside, carrying their cargo of confused and increasingly bewildered German prisoners toward an uncertain destination. Through the slatted sides of the truck beds, the women caught fragmentary glimpses of a nation that contradicted every story they had been told. Rolling fields stretched toward horizons unmarked by craters or scorched earth, their crops growing tall and healthy under the September sun. Farmhouses dotted the landscape like something from a peaceful dream, their red barns freshly painted, their porches lined with rocking chairs that spoke of leisure time unimaginable in wartime Germany. The nurse from the Eastern Front pressed her face closer to the wooden slats, her breath catching as she took in the scene. She thought of her younger brother, who had died of malnutrition 2 winters earlier, his body too weak to fight off a simple fever. His thin wrists and hollow cheeks haunted her memory, yet here she was witnessing a land where cattle grazed in fields so green they seemed to glow, where chickens pecked freely in farmyards, where abundance appeared to be the natural order of things rather than a distant memory. Inside the truck, whispered conversations began to take on a different tone. The secretary, who had first dared to call the American soldiers handsome, now spoke more boldly. "Look at those houses," she murmured in German, pointing toward a white farmhouse with a wraparound porch. "They're untouched, no broken windows, no bomb damage, nothing." Another woman, a communications operator who had worked in Berlin, added with growing amazement, "The children we passed, did you see how healthy they looked, how clean their clothes were?" The physical evidence of American prosperity was overwhelming and undeniable. In Germany, even before the bombing intensified, rationing had reduced daily life to a struggle for basic necessities. Here, they passed grocery stores with full windows, gas stations where automobiles lined up casually for fuel, and restaurants with signs advertising steaks and fresh vegetables. The contrast was so stark, it felt like traveling between different worlds rather than different countries. One of the American drivers, a farm boy from Nebraska, occasionally glanced back at his passengers through the truck's rear window. He saw their wide eyes, their obvious amazement at the passing landscape, and felt a mixture of pride and sympathy. These women had clearly expected something very different from America. He couldn't know that they had been taught to expect a nation of savages living in a wasteland of industrial decay, but he could see their surprise at finding green fields and peaceful towns instead. The trucks passed through small communities where American civilians went about their daily routines with a normalcy that seemed miraculous to the German prisoners. Children played in schoolyards, their laughter carrying on the wind. Women hung laundry on lines behind neat houses, the white sheets and colorful dresses flapping like flags of domestic tranquility. Men worked in their gardens or tinkered with automobiles and driveways, their movements unhurried and purposeful, rather than driven by the desperate urgency that had characterized life in Germany for years. Historians still debate whether the American homefront experience during World War II was fundamentally different from that of other Allied nations, but the evidence visible from those truck windows told its own story. This was a nation that had fought a global war while maintaining its civilian infrastructure, its agricultural productivity, and its basic standard of living. The German women were witnessing the fruits of an industrial capacity that had not only supplied massive military forces across multiple theaters, but had also continued to feed and clothe its own population. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the convoy approached a crossroads where a small crowd had gathered. American teenagers on bicycles had stopped to watch the military trucks pass, their faces showing curiosity rather than hostility. Some waved, treating the convoy like a parade rather than a prisoner transport. The gesture was casual, almost thoughtless, but it struck the German women with unexpected force. In their homeland, enemy prisoners would have faced thrown stones, angry shouts, or worse. Here, children waved as if greeting distant relatives. The emotional impact was profound and disturbing. These women had been raised to believe in the righteousness of their cause, the evil of their enemies, and the inevitability of their victory. Yet, everything they were seeing challenged those fundamental assumptions. If the Americans were truly the monsters Nazi propaganda had portrayed, why did their children wave so casually? If America was the decadent wasteland they had been told about, why were its fields so green and its towns so prosperous? The trucks began to slow as they approached the final destination, but the real journey, the journey away from propaganda-fed beliefs toward uncomfortable truths, was just beginning to accelerate. The gates of the prisoner of war camp swung open with a metallic clang that seemed to echo across the rolling countryside. But what lay beyond those barriers was nothing like the hellish prison the German women had been conditioned to expect. Instead of dark, cramped cells or brutal barracks surrounded by menacing guard towers, they found themselves looking at what resembled a small, well-organized town. Neat wooden buildings arranged in orderly rows stretched across several acres, their walls freshly painted, their windows clean and unbroken. The paths between buildings were graveled and well-maintained, while guard towers stood at measured intervals, their occupants relaxed rather than threatening. The women stepped down from the trucks with hesitant movements, their eyes darting nervously as they took in their new surroundings. The American guards who supervised their arrival carried their rifles with casual ease, the weapons slung over shoulders rather than pointed menacingly. These men looked more like park rangers than prison wardens, their expressions professional, but not cruel. When one elderly German woman stumbled slightly under the weight of her belongings, a young American corporal immediately stepped forward to steady her, his touch gentle and his voice quietly reassuring despite the language barrier. The registration process began with an efficiency that spoke of well-established procedures rather than hastily improvised cruelty. Each woman was assigned a number, photographed, and given a brief medical examination by American Army doctors who treated them with the same professional courtesy they would show any patient. Their belongings were inspected but not confiscated unless they contained obvious contraband. And even then, the searches were conducted with respect for personal dignity that seemed almost impossible given the circumstances. What struck the women most forcefully was the absence of the systematic humiliation that Nazi propaganda had promised would await German prisoners in American hands. There were no forced marches, no beatings, no degrading treatment designed to break their spirits. Instead, they found themselves assigned to clean barracks with actual beds, not straw pallets on concrete floors, but real mattresses with clean sheets and blankets. The buildings had proper windows that let in natural light, wooden floors that were swept and mopped regularly, and heating systems that promised warmth during the approaching winter months. The first meal served in the camp dining hall was a revelation that left several women in tears. Plates arrived heaped with food that would have fed a German family for days. Thick slices of white bread with real butter, scrambled eggs that were fluffy and abundant, strips of bacon that sizzled with fat, and coffee that was strong and hot rather than the chicory substitute that had become standard in wartime Germany. Some women stared at their plates in disbelief, unable to comprehend such abundance. Others ate with desperate hunger, while tears streamed down their faces, overwhelmed by the contrast between this unexpected bounty and the meager rations they had left behind. Historians still debate whether American prisoner of war camps maintained higher nutritional standards than those of other Allied nations, but the documented records from International Red Cross inspections consistently praised the quality and quantity of food provided to German captives. The women experiencing this treatment firsthand could only compare it to their own recent memories of hunger, of carefully rationed portions, of meals that left stomachs cramping with emptiness rather than satisfied with fullness. The American soldiers who served as guards maintained a professional distance, but their behavior continued to challenge every expectation the women had formed. When rain began to fall during their second day in the camp, guards rushed to ensure that windows were properly secured and that prisoners had adequate protection from the weather. When one woman fell ill with a fever, She was immediately taken to the camp infirmary, where American medical personnel treated her with the same care they would provide to their own soldiers. The camp's daily routine was structured but not oppressive. Wake-up calls came via bells rather than shouting guards. Mealtimes were regular and adequate, and work assignments were distributed fairly among those who were able and willing to contribute. Women who had expected to be worked to death in brutal labor gangs instead found themselves assigned to kitchen duties, laundry work, or simple maintenance tasks that were well within their physical capabilities. Perhaps most surprisingly, the camp included recreational facilities that seemed almost luxurious given the circumstances. A small library contained books in German as well as English, while a recreation area featured tables and chairs where prisoners could gather during their free time. Some evenings, American guards could be heard playing music or engaged in casual conversation, their voices carrying across the camp with none of the harsh military discipline that might have been expected in such a setting. As night fell on their first full day in the camp, the German women lay on their clean mattresses under warm blankets, staring at the ceiling and struggling to reconcile their experiences with everything they had been taught to expect. The enemy was supposed to be cruel, but had shown them kindness. America was supposed to be a wasteland, but had revealed prosperity. The propaganda that had shaped their understanding of the world was crumbling with each passing hour. Days in the prisoner of war camp settled into a rhythm that continued to defy every expectation the German women had carried with them across the Atlantic. Each morning began not with harsh commands or brutal wake-up calls, but with the gentle sound of a bell that rang through the camp like a school chime calling children to class. The women would rise from beds that were comfortable by any standard, wash with soap that was plentiful and clean, and dress in uniforms that were simple but dignified rather than degrading or humiliating. The breakfast routine became a daily source of amazement that never quite lost its power to surprise. American cooks served portions that seemed impossibly generous, thick oatmeal with brown sugar, fresh fruit when it was available, bread that was white and soft rather than the dark, heavy loaves that had become standard in wartime Germany. Coffee arrived in metal cups that steamed with real heat, and the women learned to savor not just the taste, but the simple luxury of drinking something hot and satisfying first thing in the morning. Work assignments were distributed with a fairness that stood in stark contrast to the slave labor conditions that Nazi propaganda had promised awaited German prisoners. Women who had medical training were assigned to the camp infirmary, where they worked alongside American medical personnel, treating both prisoners and guards with equal professionalism. Those with clerical skills found themselves helping with administrative tasks, while others were assigned to kitchen duties, laundry work, or maintenance of the campgrounds. The work was meaningful rather than punitive, and supervisors treated the German women as collaborators rather than enemies to be punished. The American guards continued to present contradictions that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of their captors. These young men from farms and small towns across America possessed a casual friendliness that seemed genuine rather than calculated. They would nod politely when passing prisoners on the camp pathways, offer assistance when they noticed someone struggling with a heavy load, and occasionally share cigarettes or small treats from packages sent by families back home. Their behavior suggested that they viewed the German women not as monsters to be hated, but simply as people caught up in circumstances beyond their control. Physical differences between the captors and their pre-war German counterparts became more apparent with daily observation. The American soldiers moved with an easy confidence that spoke of lives lived without the constant fear of bombing raids or the grinding stress of food shortages. Their teeth were straight and white, their skin clear and healthy, their bodies well proportioned from adequate nutrition and regular exercise. When they played baseball in the camp's recreational area during their off-duty hours, the German women would sometimes gather at windows to watch, fascinated by the casual athleticism displayed by men who seemed untouched by the hardships of war. Conversations among the prisoners began to take on increasingly bold themes as days turned into weeks. The secretary from Berlin, who had initially whispered her observations about handsome American soldiers, now spoke more openly about the contradictions she was witnessing. "They treat us better than some of our own officers treated us," she confided to the nurse during one evening meal. The older woman nodded thoughtfully, remembering her own experiences with German military hierarchy that had often been harsh and demanding even toward German personnel. Evening hours in the camp revealed perhaps the most unexpected aspect of American prisoner of war administration. Rather than being locked in their barracks and forbidden to move about, the women were allowed supervised recreation time in common areas. They could write letters, read books from the camp library, or simply talk among themselves about their experiences and their hopes for the future. American guards maintained their presence, but their supervision felt protective rather than threatening, as if they were ensuring the prisoners' safety rather than preventing their escape. Historians still debate whether American treatment of German prisoners of war was influenced more by practical considerations or by genuine humanitarian impulses. But the daily reality experienced by these women left little doubt about the character of their treatment. When autumn weather turned cold, extra blankets appeared without being requested. When one woman celebrated a birthday, American kitchen staff quietly provided a small cake that had been baked specially for the occasion. Such gestures were small in themselves, but their cumulative effect was profound. The contrast with conditions they had left behind in Germany became more painful with each passing day of adequate food and comfortable shelter. Letters from home, when they occasionally arrived through Red Cross channels, brought news of continued hardship, food shortages, and the massive task of rebuilding bombed cities. Meanwhile, the German women found themselves living better as prisoners in America than many of their families were living as free citizens in their devastated homeland. The psychological impact of this realization was complex and troubling. Gratitude for their treatment warred with loyalty to their country, while growing doubts about Nazi propaganda competed with lifelong beliefs about German superiority and American decadence. These women were experiencing firsthand the collapse of a worldview that had been carefully constructed through years of systematic indoctrination, and the process was as painful as it was inevitable. As winter settled over the prisoner of war camp, bringing with it a soft blanket of snow that muffled sounds and transformed the orderly buildings into something resembling a peaceful village, the German women found themselves facing the most profound transformation of their lives. Months had passed since their arrival on American soil, months during which every day had brought new evidence that the world they thought they understood had been built on foundations of deliberate deception. The nurse who had once treated wounded German soldiers in field hospitals now worked alongside American medics in the camp infirmary, their collaboration so natural and professional that nationality seemed irrelevant to the task of healing. She found herself thinking often of her fiancé, lost somewhere in the vastness of the Eastern Front and wondering what he would think of her current circumstances. Would he understand that accepting kindness from the enemy did not mean betraying her love for him? Would he forgive her growing realization that the men who had captured them were not monsters, but simply young Americans doing their duty with unexpected humanity? The secretary from Berlin had begun keeping a secret diary, writing in careful German script about her daily observations of camp life. Her entries revealed a mind grappling with contradictions that threatened to overturn everything she had believed about the war, about her country's enemies, and about the nature of truth itself. "Today, an American guard helped me carry laundry when he saw me struggling with the heavy basket," she wrote one evening. "He reminded me of my brother Klaus, the same gentle way of moving, the same quick smile. How can our enemies be so much like the people we love?" Christmas arrived with a celebration that defied every expectation the women had formed about American attitudes toward their German prisoners. The camp administration had organized a simple but genuine holiday observance, complete with a decorated tree, carols sung in both English and German, and a special dinner that featured roasted meat, fresh vegetables, and even small gifts that had been purchased with funds from the camp welfare budget. American soldiers joined the prisoners for the evening meal, their presence comfortable rather than oppressive, their conversation friendly despite the language barriers that made communication difficult. The physical evidence of American prosperity continued to challenge German assumptions about their captors' civilization. Packages arrived regularly for American personnel, filled with food, clothing, and small luxuries that spoke of families back home living in comfort despite their nation's involvement in global warfare. The German women observed these deliveries with growing amazement, comparing them to the increasingly desperate letters they occasionally received from their own families, letters that spoke of continued rationing, damaged homes, and the grinding difficulty of daily survival in defeated Germany. Letters from home brought news that made their current circumstances even more surreal. German cities remained in ruins, their population struggling with shortages of food, fuel, and basic necessities. Former Nazi officials faced trials and denunciations, while ordinary citizens grappled with the revelation that their government had lied to them about virtually everything, from military progress to the treatment of prisoners and civilians in occupied territories. The women found themselves living in greater comfort as prisoners of war than their own families enjoyed as free citizens attempting to rebuild their shattered nation. The American guards, who had seemed so impossibly tall and healthy when first encountered on the ship's deck, now appeared simply as young men doing a difficult job with remarkable grace. Their casual friendliness had evolved into genuine concern for the welfare of their charges, and many had learned basic German phrases to make communication easier. Some shared photographs of their families, showing the prisoners images of American farms, small towns, and relatives who looked remarkably normal and peaceful rather than the savage militaristic society that Nazi propaganda had described. Historians still debate whether the comprehensive re-education of German prisoners of war was a deliberate American policy or an unintended consequence of humane treatment, but the psychological transformation of these women was undeniable. They had arrived carrying hatred and fear instilled by years of propaganda, but they were discovering that their supposed enemies possessed the same basic human qualities of kindness, fairness, and decency that they valued in their own people. As spring approached and rumors of eventual repatriation began to circulate through the camp, many of the women faced an unexpected emotional conflict. They longed to return to their families and their homeland, yet they dreaded leaving the security and relative comfort they had found in American captivity. The prospect of returning to a Germany that lay in ruins, where food remained scarce and the future uncertain, seemed almost more frightening than remaining prisoners in a land that had treated them with unexpected mercy. The nurse stood at the camp fence one evening, watching American soldiers play their eternal game of baseball in the fading light, their laughter carrying across the yard like music from another world. She pressed her hand against the chain-link barrier and whispered a prayer, not for victory or revenge, but for understanding. She had learned that propaganda could paint enemies as monsters, but reality revealed them as human beings capable of both kindness and cruelty, just like herself and her own people. When the final call came for repatriation to Germany, these women would carry with them memories that no amount of propaganda could erase, memories of warm meals and clean beds, of medical care and genuine concern, of enemies who had looked into their eyes and treated them as fellow human beings deserving of dignity and respect. That memory, both painful and luminous in its contradiction of everything they had been taught, would remain with them forever, a testament to the complex truth that war's greatest casualties are often the lies we tell ourselves about those we are taught to hate. If you enjoyed this story of human complexity in wartime, consider subscribing to see more untold historical narratives. Until our next journey into the past, thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon.